arms sales are a way of keeping the relationship alive even when there are political tensions, right? So, in a way, defense relations are the default mode of this relationship.
Welcome to TCF World Podcast, Episode 11. Why we shouldn't expect an Arab NATO, at least not anytime soon. On this episode of TCF World, we'll talk to Brian Katulis, a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, and then after the break to Emile Hokayem, a senior fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. Brian, thanks for coming on the podcast.
It's great to be with you, Thanasi.
So, Brian, you've been part of this project, Order from Ashes, New Foundations for Security in the Middle East. And before we get into some of those ideas of yours, I just want to ask you a little bit about the research you did for this project, which I think began as a question of whether there's any prospect of building something like an Arab NATO or an Islamic NATO for the Middle East, some kind of peacekeeping force. And what did you find was the prospect for some kind of regional entity?
Well, this chapter is informed by another piece of research I did back in 2016 with my colleagues at the Center for American Progress that was aimed at outlining a new strategy for the next U.S. administration. And what we looked at were a more immediate, some of the proposals for security cooperation that we had heard from Egypt's President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and others, and offered some, I think, modest ideas about what the U.S. Could do. In this particular chapter, what was fun to do was to take a look at the history of attempts of security cooperation in the Middle East for more than 50 years or so, and then outline the lessons for the prospects of broad partnerships in the near future.
So if it's more or less impossible to imagine some kind of unified Arab peacekeeping force that could go into a conflict like Syria or into a place like Yemen for a variety of reasons, including because some of the nations involved are combatants in the war. What is possible? What are the sort of lesser gambits that aren't pipe dreams?
Some of the more modest examples of cooperation, which we've seen already, and some of them actually haven't been great for regional security, say Saudi Arabia's cooperation with the UAE in Yemen demonstrates that at least at an operational and tactical level, countries are trying to get their militaries together. Now, the problem, of course, with Yemen is that it's been devastating and actually contradictory and runs contrary to what the stated goals are, which is strengthening the state system. So that's one. I think the anti-Islamic State coalition that was assembled in 2014, and still fights to this day, offers some examples where countries have come together to actually work on some of the military operations that have led to the Islamic State's essential military defeat in Iraq and Syria, and that the multinational air campaign has provided some crucial lessons learned. Again, mostly at that tactical and operational level. There are other examples where countries have cooperated, and again, the results have not been great in places like Libya.
Like the different coalitions from the region that are fighting on different sides of the Libyan civil war.
Yeah, exactly, right? Libya. And part of that is if you go to these countries, as I do, and you talk to the leaders and people who have initiated some of these campaigns, they really don't have strategic clarity about what the end state is, and if they do, it's not realistic. And in that regard, it's not dissimilar to what I heard from the George W. Bush administration when they talked about the Iraq War. And when you have that lack of precision or lack of realism when it comes to the end state that these military operations are driving towards, because it's not just the military components that are key for stabilization. It's what kind of governance will come next, what's the economic model, and it's those sorts of things that have hampered any effort to actually produce success on the ground. But to answer your initial question, I think taking some of these efforts by countries themselves that have been much more organic, that have been driven by their own threat perceptions, how they see their own immediate environment and what they need to attend to, is much more effective than I think some sort of more theoretical or academic effort to impose a broad region-wide coalition. So actually tapping into the self-defined interests of these countries and then trying to help guide them, in a sense, towards better success than they've had to date to produce stability in the region.
So absent, I mean, I think we all agree there just isn't a fertile climate for like a real strategic confluence of visions among these states. So we're looking at something that's much more sort of basic building blocks, some kind of security architecture that allows them to interact, whether it's over, like you just suggested, shared threats or maybe opportunistic interference in some neighbor. But so, I mean, a couple of problems with that leap to mind, and one is that even among really like-minded subgroups in the region, so say the Arab Gulf countries in the GCC, or the countries that all supported the Syrian rebels, or the group that is supporting Khalifa Haftar in Libya, even those like unsavory or opportunistic small coalitions don't have a shared even tactical set of goals, much less strategic vision. So what are the kinds of things we're talking about? Just getting basic military interoperability, communications channels. Like what is the thing that one would try to promote when you're talking about security cooperation or architecture?
Yeah, it's at those sort of very basic levels and defining something that actually is specific and is achievable for these countries when it comes to cooperation. So a good example would be, rather than undermining state stability in Yemen, taking the tools that, say, the United States offers in cooperation with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and encouraging them to actually produce some sort of meaningful success that actually isn't just defeating your adversary, but then producing some sense of stability and then the building blocks for governance. And again, not the U.S. doing this, but helping these countries work through that. Another example might be in the Sinai in Egypt, where we do know from reporting that it's not just the Egyptians that are fighting there. There's been a coalition that has tried to support the efforts that have not been very successful to date. So having something that is quite modest, maybe even just part of the Sinai, and demonstrating this as a model for success for not only the Egyptians themselves, but the types of cooperation that have happened, or Eastern Libya and other places. So thinking small with those building blocks, because the problem with going towards sort of a bigger effort at regional security cooperation is this lack of consensus across the region. I remember going to the region, I go quite often, in early 2014 and meeting with the leaders of Jordan and then the UAE and then Israel. And in these three countries, which at the macro level many analysts describe as aligned against Iran and concerned about a number of different things, their priorities were just completely different. The Jordanian leadership was first and foremost concerned about the Syrian civil war. That was their number one priority. The Israelis were concerned about Iran and saw that as the strategic threat. And the Emiratis at that time, and I think even to this day, were concerned about political Islam and the Muslim Brotherhood. So those competing strategic priorities really made it hard for anyone to who would propose some sort of grand regional Arab NATO, for instance, in tacit cooperation with Israel to counter Iran in any meaningful way. So it's better, I think, to define something that is more modest at the even subnational level in places like Yemen or inside of Egypt, and something that is very small and modest that demonstrates success.
And it's very fashionable these days to sort of downplay the potential for any American impact in the region, especially any positive impact. And at the same time, the umbrellas that exist, or the successful coalitions that exist, like the anti-ISIS campaign, and even the arms client. I mean, the arms clients in the Gulf, whose entire military infrastructure is provided by the United States and is interwoven with U.S. bases in the region. Those seem to be the two most potent examples of some kind of existing architecture with all the drawbacks that it obviously entails. I'm curious on two levels. One, what is the potential for the U.S. to play a role in deepening some kind of architecture or cooperation in the security sphere? And two, under Trump, does that change, or sort of under does the trajectory remain the same despite the rhetoric?
I think the potential is greater than most observers realize, because the U.S. does actually have a lot of leverage given these relationships it's built up across the region since the 1980s. The problem is successive U.S. governments have not been willing to use that leverage to shape and influence the actions of our partners in the region. Even under President Obama, who had pretty bad relations with many of the Gulf countries, he was unwilling to use leverage in 2015 to shape the actions of Saudi Arabia and the UAE on the Yemen war. And that's for a range of complicated reasons. But I think we have a great deal of influence. Now, the challenge here is that most of these countries themselves resist any sort of regional cooperation, even when they have a natural interest with other countries in the region. They prefer a hub and spoke relationship with the United States, meaning they put a higher premium, Saudi Arabia, for instance, on the bilateral relationship just because with the United States, just because the U.S. has such superior firepower and capabilities. So, in a sense, this dangerous and dysfunctional dependency on the United States security umbrella, which has actually been quite incomplete, hasn't been great for the region overall, combined with this unwillingness on the part of successive U.S. administrations to basically use its leverage and in essence, have a deeper conversation with each of the countries saying, look, we want to move you towards greater cooperation amongst each other. Take care of your own problems. Now,
is this somehow in America's interest to have this hub and spoke model where which prevents Arab countries from pooling their resources in a way that would allow them to, say, balance Israel or defy the United States on security issues?
In some ways, that's I think been a consequence of that, but I don't think that's the intention, if that makes any sense. There is no grand plan or theory coming from the United States about the Middle East. Nobody's really driving that, and I think that's. But that is in essence what's been created. What I'm saying is that if you look over the trajectory of the next couple of decades, a smart thing to do would be to encourage this cooperation. Because the Arab states, in essence, have a lot of problems that are largely internal to their own countries that are undermining security. And it would be good in the U.S. interest to move towards this model because most Americans simply don't want to invest as much as we've had in the Middle East. Now, to your second question on Trump, I think we've moved far away from any sense that the United States might use any leverage with these countries. And in essence, President Trump has offered a blank check to some of our closest partners rather than trying to motivate them in any particular way. And I think that's a real missed opportunity. I think Trump came into office and did some important things symbolically to try to reassure some countries like Saudi Arabia and Israel, and to deal with this trust deficit that had emerged under the Obama administration. But then he squandered what I think was leverage in trying to, in essence, allow these countries in the region to continue to do what they're doing and not really shape their actions in ways that benefit their interests or ours.
Well, let's hope that that a decade hence we see a Middle East that's at least moving somehow in the direction of coordination instead of deeper entropy. Thanks a lot. I was talking with Brian Katulis at the Center for American Progress in Washington, D.C., and this is Thanasi Kambanis in Beirut. After the break, we'll be talking to Emile Hokayem. Order from Ashes, New Foundations for Security in the Middle East is a multi-year TCF project supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. TCF experts are studying new ways to manage conflict and promote stability, You can order the book and read the reports on our website. Go to tcf.org and look for the Arab Regional Security page. This is Thanasi Kambanis. I'm back now talking on the phone with Emile Hokayem, the senior fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. He's talking to me from London. Emile, thanks for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So in your report on for this project for Order from Ashes on the Gulf states, you make an argument that that the Gulf states are struggling to find the right balance among the different kinds of external allies that they depend on for security. Can you explain how that works and explain where America and who else fits into this sort of seesaw balancing act?
So the Gulf states are keenly aware of their own weaknesses, whether in terms of size, in terms of geographic position, in terms of level of institution building, in terms of military strengths, etc. So they have sought all along their history to find those external security partners that can provide for external security. Basically, they have a grand strategy, which is to internationalize their security, which means basically building ties with as many relevant nations as possible in security, political, economic terms, so that these nations have a stake in the security, survival, stability, and success of these states. The difficulty is that those Gulf states don't necessarily share the same vision. They're often competitors in that sense. The second one is that it's precisely this search for security that at times creates or exacerbates sources of tension within the region. Now, traditionally, since 1971, when the Brits lowered their presence in the region, the US has played this role of external security provider, and in a way it worked well for the Gulf states. The US provided security, military muscle, etc. over time.
Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait in 1991.
That's the most prominent example, but even in the 80s, during the tanker wars, and so on. But the problem is that in a way it made the Gulf states a bit complacent and sometimes willing to be more aggressive than they would have been otherwise, because the biggest kid on the block was there for them. So adapting to the changing regional politics and the shifting global balance of power is creating a set of new challenges for the Gulf states. They have to find people to complement, not replace, but complement the very specific and at times peculiar relationships they've had with the US.
So is this American rivals like Russia and China who provide that extra balance, or is it American frenemies like Turkey or friends like France?
It's a bit everyone, and that's the point in their strategy, is that there is no real veto on anyone. I mean, of course, there are specifics. So, for instance, the UAE really distrusts Turkey, so doesn't see Turkey as a fundamental security partner to the country, while Qatar has good relations with Turkey and sees Turkey as part of its security mix. So these are the tensions that actually, shape Gulf regional politics today. So, but pretty much everyone qualifies to play that role. And so what works in favor of the Gulf states is essentially they have the means to this end. They use their economic relationships, their sovereign wealth funds, and an array of other instruments, including soft power, to build and strengthen those relationships. So, for instance, when the UAE hosts the Louvre in Abu Dhabi, or Qatar hosts the World Cup in 2022. It's a way of putting themselves on the map, of strengthening their strategic branding, of reaching to constituencies abroad that otherwise would look at those states in very one-dimensional ways, just as, oil or gas producers, right? But if you add to that relationship, even in non-traditional security terms, you're actually giving a stake to more people in your own security, in your own survival. Now, the other problem, on top of creating or exacerbating tensions within the Gulf states, has to do with Iran. Iran seeks the opposite. Iran argues that the fundamental source of tension in the region is precisely the existence and the role of foreign actors, foreign countries who have a security role in the region. So Iran seeks the exit of those forces, of those countries, and resents the strong security and defense relationships that the Gulf states have with other countries, which is totally rational because Iran as a larger country, as a big power, would be a dominant force. Is
that a sincere position, though? I mean, does Iran want Russia to have a less pronounced security role in the region? Or do they only dislike foreign involvement when it's not on their side?
In the current context, Iran does welcome a Russian role because it balances the US one. But, the real preference would be for even countries like Russia not to have a regional role in the region. In the Persian Gulf. So my point here is that there's a big difference between preference and policy, right? Policy is about what can be realistically aimed for and implemented. Preferences is basically they're wet dreams at times. So you can't always pursue your preferences in this case. So yes, Russia has re-emerged in the Middle East since its intervention in Syria as a key player. It's courted by a lot of regional powers. They see Russia as inescapable interlocutor in some places. In others, they see it as a preferred interlocutor. And we see this, for instance, over Libya and other places. Now, the problem with Russia is that it's unclear what real offering it can make to the Gulf states. Russia essentially exports oil and weapons, energy and weapons, and the Gulf states are, these are not the two things they need the most. They can get their weapons elsewhere. Although we see a new trend, for instance, with Saudi Arabia and Qatar, discussing the purchase of the S-400 missile defense system from Russia. That would be quite significant at a time where, the Americans have been trying to push for the SAD and other systems.
Well, so I was actually going to ask you about arms sales. I'm glad you brought that up. One of the mysteries for me in trying to understand the dynamics of the Arab Gulf states and the U.S. is that, on the one hand, the U.S. has provided this very extensive and expensive security umbrella for so long. And on the other hand, it seems like in practice, the U.S. acts as if it needs the Arab Gulf countries more than the Arab Gulf countries act like they need the U.S. And at first blush, it seems like a sort of alliance problem. How is it that this weaker, the weaker recipient of aid or of, in this case, security help can so willfully ignore the big superpower? And the more I look at this unfolding, especially in recent years with the Qatar crisis, the war in Yemen, and other things where there have been divergence of preferences, and the Arab Gulf countries have been able to do what they want, is the arms sales equation. That the huge amount of cash that these Arab Gulf countries are able to infuse into the economies of the United States, the United Kingdom, and other arms supplying nations seems to be the most important factor, and therefore they can have their policy preferences and security preferences on every other front. Is that a reasonable way of trying to understand this, and sort of how significant are these arms contracts to the overall equation?
Okay, the first point is to understand the fundamental rationale from the Gulf states when they buy weapons. The primary rationale is that arm purchases are a form of insurance policy. This is what essentially ties down, or those large states, France, the U.S., the U.K., and others, is that arms sales are a way to build a military-to-military defense relationship that is the bedrock of the relationship more broadly. The second point is that arms sales are a way of keeping the relationship alive even when there are political tensions, right? So, in a way, defense relations are the default mode of this relationship. When everything is bad, you can still talk to the Pentagon, you can still talk to, the large arm manufacturers, and that keeps the relationship on. So, for instance, during the Obama administrations, the relationship between the U.S. and the Gulf states got strained at many times. And yet, defense relations continued, and in fact, arms sales increased during that time. So the point is that if you're in the Gulf, if you're a Gulf leader, you much prefer talking to military officials, Pentagon people, etc., because it's one-dimensional. You talk about security, you talk about defense. When you don't have good relations with the White House, because the White House wants to talk about other issues, about human rights, about governance, and so on, then you can go back to your favorite interlocutors, the generals and others. Now, the third point is that I understand why a lot of people, and I'm one of them, are shocked by the amount spent on arms sales. I think this is a very legitimate discussion to have, including from the part of Gulf citizens who can rightly wonder why so much money is spent in military gear and kit, and not on social services and so on. Although the significant amounts are spent on those issues. But the point here is that we shouldn't let the sheer numbers basically drive our perception of the balance of power. So I work at the ISS, where one of our flagship product is the military balance, where every year we look at defense spending and defense budgets, etc., across the world. And we see very clearly that the Gulf states are spending more money on that. And in comparison, we look at Iran, which spends less. And therefore, people look at the difference and say, oh, look, one side is a lot more aggressive than the other. Well, yes and no. I mean, it depends on the strategies you have. It depends on the weaponry you buy. It depends on whether you can deploy that weaponry. Is it defensive or not? I mean, military missile defense, for instance, is very costly, but it's not totally deployed at this point, and it's mostly a defensive system. I mean, of course, if you have a conflict, having defense makes you more risk-taking, right? But my point is that we need to have a more sophisticated, more refined discussion about this aspect and just be fixated on the big numbers, which are startling. I'll certainly agree with that.
Well, does that huge investment in the tens of billions in arms purchase from the United States, does that essentially buy an ironclad alliance politically between Washington and the Arab Gulf states?
Yes and no, because first it's important to note that the Gulf states are security partners of the U.S. They're not treaty allies. So the U.S., unless there's secret agreements, etc., is not obligated to come to the rescue, even though the density of the relationship, the tripwire effect, the fact that you have American troops in those countries, etc., really does amount to a kind of security guarantee. Now, the saying is that the U.S. says that it's there to defend the external security of the Gulf states. The problem often is that the Gulf states' understanding of external security is not necessarily the same as the U.S. understanding of external security. Because, in the Gulf, everything in the minds of Gulf decision makers, everything is connected. So they may face a local opposition or insurgency that they consider as linked to Iraq or Iran or others, and then they say it's an external security threat. So there's a lot of ambiguity in this relationship. Formalizing a security relationship would be also very difficult. Because, in the U.S., try to imagine the debate in Congress if the U.S. were to offer a formal security guarantee to, Saudi or some other country, the way it has with NATO or other allies and so on. The politics would be very difficult. Likewise, in the Gulf states. There is still, a massive anti-American popular sentiments and even elite sentiments. And certainly in the past, I would say 10 years, with the Obama strategy of retrenchment from the region, and now I don't know how to characterize the Trump approach to the region. I would say, let's say total disarray, to be honest. If you're the Gulf states, you really wonder if you really want to formalize this relationship more. You probably, what you have right now is probably satisfactory and the most you will ever get.
Well, Emile, that ambiguity, I think, drives a lot of the instability that we're going to continue to see. We'll leave it there for now. This is Thanasi Kambanis in Beirut for the TCF World podcast. TCF World has been brought to you by the Century Foundation, a progressive public policy think tank that seeks to foster opportunity, reduce inequality, and promote security at home and abroad. For more information about the work that TCF does, please visit tcf.org or follow us on Twitter and Facebook.